Up next, we have Andrew Barrette from Boston College. Do you have a PowerPoint or anything to get hooked up on? Okay.
Okay, now is a time for revenge.
The return of the cartoons.
Now we suffer.
I almost just defended Descartes, but I bit my tongue. Okay. I will later, don't worry. Thank you to the organizers, of course, for putting all this together and for having me along with all these interesting and great folks who have graciously dealt with me in conversation for the last couple of days. Some more than others, but all nevertheless. And this group is well aware of the consequences of the breakdown of belief, just as it understands how belief is fundamental to our meaningful and valuable world. As we've been discussing it, belief, following Bernard Lonergan, speaks to the social character of knowledge, which is, yes, indeed, still today's issue. We might also say that belief is an intersubjective horizon from and in which meaning and value appear, or not. Belief is this insofar as it both conditions the range of that appearance and is conditioned by this appearance. This conditioning includes feelings, insofar as the mass and momentum, as Lonergan says, of that which appears to us is effectively charged, appearing as more or less worthwhile, for example. Here I wish to talk a bit about how horizons come together, fuse, as Lonergan says following Gadamer, between people who are seeking to understand together. Before saying more about that, however, let me note, along with many of our speakers today who've allowed me to cut a lot of this paper down, as many of others have said today, how the breakdown in belief introduces all manners of what I tend to call fragmentation and fixation. For a belief wanes, so does unity. We no longer believe each other or in each other. We believe only in ourselves and our own experience, our own immanently generated knowledge. Of course, this knowledge is then involved in a countersense, since, after all, it still relies on belief. We detest scientists, for example, who yet design and support our technologies that we use. We distrust politicians who yet plan and implement the order of the day, however disordered it is in fact. From the base of living out of this countersense, we also add to the fragmentation, even in our detesting distrust, which itself is a sort of action. And so the breakdown furthers, as we, however, implicitly distrust ourselves. And so we fixate on the little things we do know, and totalize them over against all else that must be against us. Indeed, we become suspicious and upset, turned over against all that which we might believe, all that which we should believe. In this attitude, authentic authorities have no standing except maybe as opposition. Thus, so-called norms, by which was really meant agreements based on beliefs with each other, that which is socially normal, are dropped. And ultimately, really, tradition is tossed. We do not completely shatter ourselves, but perhaps worse, continually to dig our own graves, as Lonergan says, with relentless consistency, as we try to assert ourselves ever more and above and beyond the other, fixating and fixing ourselves, fixating on ourselves and fixing ourselves and our lives or our group's versions of events of their lives. Now, with that rehearsal in tow, I now only wish at most to uncover a little philosophical pebble or two on a well-prepared path, namely the path of discernment and direction of feelings to the realization of true and absolute values, and how in that unity must prevail above all. It's a line from Franz Brentano, for what it's worth. Indeed, there's a long tradition of spiritual discernment in the Abrahamic tradition, noted by Patrick Byrne in his book, Ethics of Discernment, on which I rely especially for the concept of horizon of feelings, but it's all there. First, though, consider how Joseph de Guibert, a teacher of Lonergan at the Gregorian, notes the following old wisdom about spiritual discernment and direction. It requires, de Guibert says, and one might imagine the young Lonergan hearing this in the classroom of the newly opened building of the Gregorian, which is today. A great patience and humility, de Guibert says, not only, though above all, because the movements of the Holy Spirit are difficult to discern, but also because we do not know ourselves so well. As de Guebert saying here is, we do not know ourselves so well, we might learn from any insightful method into the soul, as he says, including, perhaps especially, philosophy. On that point, I wish to dwell a bit, so let me offer an image. Recall that familiar category of people from Plato's Republic, Book 5, namely the lovers of sights and sounds. Plato seems to identify here a symptom of what Lonergan calls general bias. That is how, from the fact of the unity and distinction of our animal extroversion, animal knowing with its empirical objectivity, and human reason with its discursive grasp and affirmation of the really true, the absolute, objective absolute, that there's also a human tendency towards sensation, towards which the present is the present at hand, so to speak. As Aristotle summarizes, the eyes take pleasure in seeing and the ears hearing. But since a human subject is unified, a unified whole being, where there's also an intelligent desire to know, Plato already notices that this desire gets mixed up, as he puts it, with the pleasure of the senses. And so, as Edmund Husserl does not tire to point out in his ethical lectures, which are totally reliant on Franz Brentano, Husserl says, the hedonist uses all his rational resources to get more pleasure of the senses. So the reason is fully engaged without being fully cultivated. All that effort, ever refined, ever sophisticated, without ever getting beyond, that is, without ever transcending the senses, really. That's tantamount to decline. Indeed, it's tantamount to what the young Lonergan calls the decay of the intellect. It's a decay, for it continues to set conditions for further decline, further disuse of intelligence, until we arrive relying on the dissolute, literally those who've been separated from the unity, dissolved of it. Indeed, many people are lovers of sights and sounds, philodoxas, as Plato says, rather than philosophers, philosophia, who love the beautiful itself. And so also, Plato says, love sights and sounds, but as manifestations, participations in the idea of beauty. Without getting into the Platonic noetics and eidetics, consider what happens right after Socrates asks his interlocutor to inquire with him about how to get one who believes in the beautiful things to believe in the idea of beauty. How does one do that? Plato asks through the interlocutor. Well, you won't be so surprised to know that Plato has Socrates ask some questions, which are ever more leading to the insight, to grasp the idea, the content of understanding. And in so doing, Plato has Socrates work towards igniting the flame of the desire to know, toward the intimacy with that desire to know itself, really. But rather than following on that process, which many have, Socrates also says the following about the person who he and his interlocutor are trying to lead towards the truth. He says, "Let us take something to comfort him and persuade him gently, concealing that he is not well." Here's our image, which I'll go through rather rapidly to elucidate the point made by de Guibert and to place in the context of Lonergan's context of belief, in order to shed some light on how horizons might fuse, especially the horizons of feelings. Now, we might note that Lonergan introduces the aim of, Plato introduces the aim of persuasion, about which libraries overfloweth, though too often excised from the qualifier, gentleness. Without gentleness, persuasion is mere logical warfare, from which, as Clayton suggested yesterday, no success emerges. And Plato knows this is unsuccessful. Holding in abeyance a moment this term gentle, consider first the context in which it occurs, which is indicated right before the conjunction in the Greek. Let us take something to soothe him, Plato says. This term, to soothe, paramoutheistai, the root of which is muthos, a story. That soothing speech is not a lie in the sense of a misleading statement. It's related rather more to that oft-quoted noble lie of Plato's, which is a leading, actually. A leading which is, importantly, effectively charged towards the insight. In other words, it's a meeting someone where they are in order to accompany them to the end, if you would like to use that sort of evangelical language. That means Plato thinks So I think this is endlessly fascinating, concealing that the other is not well. Why? Well, let me also linger here on the negation, not well. For if we wish to speak of a crisis, we must speak of this. This usage of crisis has not only a juridical aspect, which is about distinguishing, judging, and choosing, and so on, but also a medical diagnostic aspect. It indicates a crisis, indicates a turning point in the course of a disease. The European nations are sick, Husserl says at the beginning of the crisis lectures. And for him, phenomenological philosophy would function, the philosopher would be the functionary, as an instrument of healing. And Lonergan suggests one might be inclined to ask whether our economic and social structure is not rather a sick man needing treatment than a dying man awaiting burial. And more, Lonergan goes on to indicate in this piece, and elsewhere, of course, the need for a supernatural healer with whom we participate in times of crisis. For indeed, we humans are, as it were, ever in a time of crisis, a time of decision. We are sick. Though each time, each moment, each point of decision in the juridical aspect has its novelty, some more obviously momentous for our trajectory and healing of the disease, there is the possibility, as Nietzsche points out, Brother Nietzsche, to pretend this moment you have finally noticed is somehow more momentous than any other you failed to notice. For in doing so then, in other words, in totalizing this moment, you then live a lie, and not a noble one, but the worst sort. It's a little terrifying, I think, but so the one leading must not highlight the destructive dimension of feelings at work in this person, the moment of crisis, that you're not well. Because that means, so the destructive dimension of feelings at work in this person, which means the loving of sights and sounds, and not the sights and sounds themselves. Why? Well, Plato tells us through Socrates, because here's a desire for knowledge. In this case, beauty itself is already at work here. It's just that they're stuck, or the word that often gets translated as imprisoned. Imprisoned in an eidolon or a copy. It is a copy, I suggest, because it still appears, but does not appear as what is due to a restriction of that horizon. In other words, the horizon of feelings doesn't appear what is and that which should be valued. Because the loving is loving the sights and sounds, not loving the loving, as it were. The conditions and the conditioned. I use the example, and Francesca made me think of this with my students. I play something old, I'm not terribly sophisticated, so I'll play something Motown. That's sophisticated, what am I talking about, right? So I'll play oftentimes the Supremes. Who doesn't love Diana? I mean, come on. And I'll, sort of just organically come in and pop on YouTube or whatever, and a song they might recognize, and then I'll say, did you hear that bass line? That's Jimmy Garrison. He played with Coltrane. And they look at me and blink, as Nietzsche says, and they're like, did you see her earrings? This is what a student last said, actually the same student I mentioned before. Like, did you see the costumes? And it's true. The costumes are great, right? In this respect, as Byrne emphasizes, I'll come back to this example, following Lonergan, insights do not occur as abstract from the horizon of feelings, which is concrete and dynamic. So again, one being led can't simply be told by another. The horizon of feeling is not ready to hear, is not ready to see. Especially, so the turbulence that this causes, if one were to interject oneself right away, as I do, that this causes the disruption of the normalcy of the horizon in a destructive way, and so that horizon closes on itself. As Plato notes in this exchange, one only hears the voice of another as a dissonant trembling, for they're still in the horizon of the desire of sights and sounds. In other words, they only believe in the horizon of, as it were, extroversion. Though the dialectic tension is such as that they feel more that there's underneath the feelings they have and the insights they're having, because something more is indeed appearing. So to serve in the reconstitution of the horizon of feelings, one must comfort the other by way of stories, a way of stories that bear the truth and the true value in need of communication. If one tries to communicate the true and the true value straight away, not only won't it appear as such, but it'll likely appear as a disvalue, another copy of a copy. Why do I need another copy when my copy's just fine? Why will the student, let's say, it's not so gentle just to force your copy and push my copy out. Don't replace your eidolon for my eidolon. This communication can take a long time, and so it takes, as Plato says, patience, macrothumia, to become long-suffering, to suffer with one who, right, it's a suffering with, really, one who, as Plato says, is not well, without telling them directly why they're not well, in order that they find out for themselves, which is the only way to recover, and that takes great care. A lack of care, Acadia, we translate it bizarrely, sloth, has no place here. Where even a bit of carelessness enters, along with impatience, there also enters, as another Jesuit of Daguerre's vintage, René Maumigny, says, while speaking about spiritual direction as well. So where any impatience enters, so does the whole communication get disrupted by the clash of egoism, or the crash of egoism. In other words, the destruction of the development of the bond between two people appears broken. And we humans are remarkably adept at detecting this assertion of the ego, equally as adept as we are as introducing the backlash to it. We can't just point out the bass line in the song as constitutive of the goodness of the song or the history of this or that and Motown and its social implications. We need to entertain a part of the whole which appears to them, because it's, after all, part of the whole, so it can be brought out to the whole as part of the whole. The old insights of depth psychology hold here to some extent. I have 10, 15 minutes. As, for example, you guys had to hear about this plenty, Joseph Marechal makes note in the way of the clinicians at the time. They'd ask of their patients, not in a way to get information, but rather formulating questions such that these questions themselves conjure image into which associative insights might arise. Analogous, I think, to what Nick was saying. That's what I heard. Marechal continues to note that the doctor directing the questions asks why this and why that, not because they know the determinate content. As a matter of fact, they do not, speaking determinately. That is, even if they do know the general direction of the response, they cannot know the patient so well that they know that for which they are looking. And so these questions are leading the patient to the interior intelligibilities, Marechal says, that allow both doctor and patient to say, oh, it's because of this. Now let me add that the depth psychologists used to call this relation a motivation, of a why and because. In early experimental psychology, this sketched out, as Marechal says, the intelligible relations, subconscious or otherwise, not yet thematized. In other words, in scholastic terms, the opacity of the subject, both for itself and for others, demands a patience, a kindness, and a humility. To discern feelings and the horizon of feelings is not so easy. The why and because are not so clear. They take a great amount of reflection, questioning and answering, and indeed feeling. And to direct others to them redoubles the issue, for one is thinking of oneself and another, as Maumigny says, in line with Daguerre. Thus, humility is paramount, and there needs to be a general will of the subject, as Maumigny puts it. Let me translate this into phenomenological terms. The relationship between subjects and in the subject must be constituting with an overarching openness to possible givenness. I steal from Husserl. What do I mean? The foregoing actions must be deliberately set such that the subjects are actively trying to reduce the assertion of the ego in order to allow for the appearance of otherwise. Of course, the one who is ill is almost incapable of this, and so the onus of responsibility is on the one who's trying to heal, to ever be aware not to assert their ego and their feelings of frustration, impatience, unkindness, lack of kindness. The ego will be there as we are conscious, but it need not assert itself, but rather assert the object of its striving, the value, not just the feeling. Still the question presses, how might that be done in a relationship wherein someone is ill, as Plato says? Plato lets them into the story, Imagine these types of people, Socrates often says. Let's look at them together. It's never, look at you. What's wrong with you? Ignatius, imagine 3 types of people. There's 3 degrees of humility. You know, the idea is, as de Guibert says, well, one of them means me, right? But you have to get that insight. The healer never crushes with facts and logic, and so on. To fuse horizons does not mean, as we've long known, imposing one on the other, as if dominating one or the other, as if it's a clash of galaxies, which I think is a wonderful image, because as some of you might know, it might sound violent and can indeed be very violent, but in fact, galaxies are so vast that they might pass through each other without running into each other at all, but they fundamentally change their constitution. That's kind of what happens when we encounter other persons, right? We might not ostensibly change ourselves, but we're reordered. In fact, this is just what happens when you encounter a person. This has been said many ways, better ways, in this conference. But it's especially difficult now to do, namely fuse horizons, as this or that phrase, this or that person, this or that tradition really gets reduced to a platform, a brand. But a brand is no charism. A charism isn't something we can sell. It doesn't arise from shareholders or a boardroom. It appears, as de Guibert says, in quiet, sometimes silent, gentle work. Work that not only often goes unnoticed, but unheeded, and which does not fret about that at all, for that's not the point. The point is that it serves a greater final end, about which I've, of course, only alluded here. But to return to philosophy, let me go back to Plato, because at the end of Book 5, Socrates says, would it be offensive to call these people lovers of opinion, or philodoxical, rather than lovers of wisdom or philosophical? Would they get very angry with us if we referred to them in this way? To which the interlocutor says, not if they are persuaded by me anyway, for it's not appropriate to be angry at the truth. The end of the book is appropriately ambiguous, I think. Does the interlocutor end by claiming, I shall persuade them, I will show them, and not gently, but assertively? But still, he nevertheless recognizes the emotional dimension and the need for detachment and indifference, so to speak, to the truth. But does he do it appropriately yet? Well, and here's the greatness of Plato, right? Socrates continues to talk for 5 more books. And he basically says the same thing again and again and again in 100 different ways with 100 different images. And you mentioned the Crito, all the way to the end. One of the last things Plato has Socrates saying in the Phaedo is, well, what should we do, they ask him. And he says, well, the same thing I've always said. And it's this beautiful image of, well, you've not been listening, but also it's not different. And there's a sort of gentleness to that. It's not, go read my book again. I'll stop there and just take some questions, but thank you so much. Go ahead.
Is this a paper about spiritual direction?
So, in the background is this whole thing where, learning so much from Pat, I sort of want to elaborate that for an ethics of discernment, you need an ethics of direction. That's my position. And I've sort of done bits and pieces, and if you don't have that, it's not that Pat's not concrete, but to sort of add that little pebble is to show it's there, but to bring out that whole thing. And in a way, that's what Lonergan learned from de Guibert. And in this big project and book, position is, and I'm not the first to sort of notice this, but I sort of draw out some of the roots. That's what, and you're working on something parallel. This is what insight is.
Yeah.
It's the exercitant.
Right.
These are a series of exercises,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. Of course, it's philosophical, and so I try to be really careful to say this is spiritual direction of a sort, but we have to be careful because it's not. And Lonergan is very careful, characteristically. But yeah, that's sort of the direction of the whole thing.
Yeah. I love the nuances because I just really appreciate it because I went also to the end of book 5, but I love the way you teased out those nuances. Kudos, Andrew. It was really
Thank you.
outstanding.
Thanks for the help. Oh, go ahead.
Go on, John.
No, 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 please.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the beautiful presentation. And if I understand you very well, it's like an invitation for a kind of, how to move from the position of decline, or how to push people from a position of decline to a higher position through some principles, probably from the inspirations of Plato and that of Lonergan. But sometimes each time I read Plato, things get more complicated for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's why I didn't work on Plato.
Yeah, because in as much as Plato and Socrates try as much as possible to extol the value of reason, but if you follow his allegory of the chariot, of the philosopher being reason, controlling the horse at the right, the one at the left, at the end of the whole thing, we found out that both were eventually of the opinion that not everyone in the society can be the philosopher.
Yeah, that's right.
Just like not everyone can be the soldier or the auxiliary with the will. But most importantly is that the lower class, the artisans, or the people sometimes described as people driven by sounds and sights, in the light of Socrates' interpretation of Plato's understanding, they are just as important as the philosophers because they provide the sentiments which reason try to get attracted to, and which also the will makes effort to, if you like, moderate so that the society can have a balance. And somehow, if you relate it even to more contemporary writers like Freud, to really have a balanced society, you need the forces of to have a balanced ego, you need the forces of the superego and need. Otherwise, you have an imbalanced ego. And let us even go to the life of Socrates himself. Remember the little joke between Socrates and his disciples when they were asking him a question about marriage and family. And Socrates said, fine, marriage, family is good. If you find peace, if you find love in marriage, you enjoy it. But if you don't find love, then you become a philosopher because he married a very cantankerous, quarrelsome wife called Xanthippe. So, and you can see that the bad habits of Xanthippe could have forced Socrates to become a philosopher since he couldn't find love in the planet. So, why do I have to draw all these analogies? If Xanthippe, being a bad woman, was the reason why Socrates became a philosopher, don't you think also the wrong side, the wrong guys in society help to keep the society in balance?
So there's a lot there. With Plato, what I'll say on the side is two things, maybe three. Plato's always 10 steps ahead of us. And that fear is what keeps me continually from working on Plato. So I'll begin with that. Secondly, is there's a danger with that too. And this is why I think Lonergan is so great, is he prepares you to approach the best Plato possible. And in other words, you make the best of him. And he's not perfect, but man, is he good. He's certainly no Christian. There's a temptation to Christianize Plato that's so readily available, I think. Huber Ronner has a great set of reflections on this. He's a man of his times, no doubt. But kind of setting that aside for a moment, the danger really, it's being too critical or too starry-eyed, and I tend towards starry-eyed, I'll admit, because what he achieved is unbelievable. It's unbelievable when you get into Plato, what he did. Every worry is ahead of you 10 steps. You think you've got him. It's not all about reason for Plato, nor is it all about emotions. It's not all about anything besides the whole. Right? He says this explicitly in the 7th letter. There's 3 marks of the philosopher. 1 is you seek the essence of things. 2, you seek the whole. And 3, you're willing to put in the work for it. And I think that's such a beautiful encapsulation. Whether it's Plato or not, we can debate. But that said, the reason why I'm saying that is because, young Lonergan starts out with his fundamental sociology by quoting Plato's Republic, the call for the philosopher king. And one of the worries of philosophical worries, not theological. The theological worry is Plato doesn't have the supernatural healing of Christ. But philosophically is, well, is the philosopher king really what we should aim at? And is it really what Plato meant is another question. But for Lonergan, I tend to read Lonergan that, as Husserl puts it, the functionary of humanity is the philosopher. True, not everyone will be the philosopher. Not everyone can be, I'm willing to say, including me, Bernard Lonergan. But what Lonergan achieved is to lead people as far as they can. And if you read Plato that way, that's what Socrates does. So the danger of the Republic is you're reading this text that's an image that basically he's making fun of a lot of things. There's a lot of irony dripping, and he's sort of poking at all sorts of things throughout the Republic. There's so many ways to read it, and I know, et cetera, but what does Socrates do throughout the Platonic corpus? He talks to everyone. That's why they want to kill him. It's because he's trying to bring everyone as far as they can. And that's annoying, right? Whether it's an artisan, a craftsman, a poet, other supposed philosophers, tyrants. Let's not go there. No, priests, right? That there's the philosophical, because the philosophical isn't just another, this is Husserl's point, I think it's Lonergan's point. The philosopher is not just another profession. It's not just another occupation. It's a divinely infused spark, which all intelligent beings have, all desirers. And that's what he's doing here now. The reason why people are sick is because they're not paying attention to what they are, right? He calls them, he says they're sunburnt. They live on the outside. And that's everyone. And that's, interestingly for me, that's how I read Lonergan, right? There's intelligence in all walks of life, as he says in Common Sense. Does that make sense? So the critique's sort of a marriage. To really get into that, I have to, where does he say it? What language is he using? Who's he saying it to? To really read Plato, you have to know a lot. And I just don't know that. Someday I hope to. I've done a lot of work with Plato, but just enough to know that I don't know enough. And I say, I'll flirt with Plato here and there, but to be a Plato scholar is another lifetime, I think. So I can't answer that question directly. Clay, and then.
I was really struck by something you said, right? I think it was at the very beginning of the.
It's when I mentioned your name.
Yeah, that was
the best part.
You said my name was my favorite part of the presentation. Yeah, love a good shout out. You
Sorry,
said
go ahead.
about Byrne and the ethics of discernment that you want to sort of bolster it with an ethics of direction, and I thought that sounds really exciting and interesting. I wonder if there are resources in the Republic for an ethics of direction.
Oh, yeah, it's the whole thing.
And it's the whole thing. So, in particular, what about like the ethics of discernment could be the cave and the divided line, but the ethics of direction would be the sun, the sun analogy, where you have some kind of orientation to the. Remember, he says it's not the good, it's like the offspring of the good. So
yeah, at the end I do this gesture of like the final end. I mean, the idea, as far as my understanding goes from reading these people who did understand it, right. is in, let's say, philosophical direction. That's not religious, spiritual direction. What you're doing is you're serving as an instrument of a finality. And that means largely getting the people out of their own way, which means also staying out of the way, which is, Lonergan says of de Guibert that he was a great spiritual director, and everyone that knew de Guibert, and my time in the archives say the same thing. He was just a spiritual master. And this is what he says constantly, that the direction is about getting out of the way. And so the assertion of the ego, what's interesting about this, and this is why I appreciate Marshall, but also other depth psychologists, those who know Doran can probably speak of this a little bit. The way in which we're aware of people asserting their ego, even if we're not making it thematic, that our feelings are aware of that and we push back. It doesn't matter how smart they are, we just don't want to hear it. Even if they're saying the right thing. I always say graduate students are like black holes of good advice. And it's in part because their egos, not only is their ego in the way, but in some sense they're in the Hobbesian universe where you're an ego that's like competition.
Right, you're obstructing.
Yeah, so it's just, right, the make-believe of a friendly universe that we tell ourselves sometimes. And it's hard to sort of, to deal with that. And I think that's quite interesting. We have to sort of set different conditions. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I mean, also, there's a difference between university philosophy and the actual universe, you know, so the idea that the kind of cosmic rehab that you're talking about, academic philosophy may play a role in that, but we're talking about something much bigger than higher education.
Yeah, you know, what's interesting, just to use a Lonergan anecdote, is for a long time he said, well, when I wrote my dissertation, Boyer told me to go work on question 111 of the Summa on grace and freedom, and this was a problem, and I did. And he told me study the loco parallella, and I did. That's Diggy Bear. And later in his life, he says, well, that's Diggy Bear. And in fact, in the original dissertation, he says, I just followed out Diggy Bear's method. But what's interesting is you have this sort of, right, my point is, later, you start to realize, and I think many of us, if not all of us, if we were honest with ourselves, are just chasing one sentence for our whole career that those who we looked up to said this was an important thing. And we're like, oh my goodness. Like,
Please can't I?
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's a good point. Cody?
Well, first, thank you. It was something that made me want to read more Plato.
Don't do it.
But, you know, just kind of a simple question, maybe not a simple question, but it's easy to say, maybe not easy to answer. But I was reminded a lot of, you know, Augustine. And
For sure.
obviously there's a lot of parallels with his kind of Platonist heritage. But I was just wondering, like, have you thought about, not that you need another voice, but what Augustine might have to contribute to kind of fleshing out some of these ideas and direction and attachments and
I have, and at least to some degree. I can always do it more. Augustine's another one that, there's a great line in Melville about Plato where the first guy who gets eaten by a whale in Moby Dick, Ahab says something, I think it's Ahab says something like, how many think ye have likewise perished in Plato's sweet honey head, or something like this. And it's like, yeah, that's right. you don't want to catch the whale, in other words, right? Like, but Augustine, yeah. So for example, I had this long excursus in this Husserl book, because in one of the books that Husserl read constantly was Augustine's Confessions. Constantly. It's one of the most marked books in Plato's library. And he has, Augustine has, so I had this long excursus about Husserl and Augustine and why. And in particular, although Husserl, I don't know, read this, but the little piece on the teacher. Yeah. And the way in which for Augustine, the teacher is Christ, which is interior. And so the outer word is actually already the inner word. And it has this whole play. And Lonergan talks a little bit about this. And others have picked this up, I think Father Whelan a little bit. But this is a whole, you know, I had this whole like idea, well, here it is, the inner and outer word. And there's actually, at the beginning of this Husserl book, there's this unpublished manuscript from Husserl where he quotes Augustine by saying, no one enters a community unless they're loved in the community, the catechism sort of. And, or it's one of those similar lines. Was it, nothing's known unless first you have a friend or something like this. And that's the other side of this, but it's in there. It's constantly being intertwined in Plato, right? Because what is Socrates if not the lover, the sun philosophane, as it were, you're philosophizing together. Of course that's Augustine. Why is Augustine writing the Confessions? It's for us, right? And that's the service that he's doing for all of us, that we're participating. And I make a big deal of this when I teach. We're reading the Confessions along with 2,000 years of students. It's too late for you to get out of this tradition. You just sat down. You know, and there's something incredible about that, because that's what Augustine wanted. But not for Augustine, right? You have to sort of imagine, I'm sort of going on, but I imagine Augustine sitting down. How painful would it be? I make my students do this. I don't tell them this. I won't collect it. But sit down. What comes to your heart and mind? because there's something. You don't want it to, but it does. When you lay there at night, as Whitman says, and you lie awake and weep out for your sins, write that down. Because you're going to read it to the class tomorrow, and I'm going to show my next year's class. And they're just like terrified, right? Like that's what Augustine felt. The worst things he did in his life. Now he knows 2,000 years because he doesn't want you to do that. I mean, you know what I mean? There's no noble lie in that. What's interesting is that question, right? That sheer humility and love and honesty, which is a little different than what Socrates is. Or maybe there is a lie in there. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too quick, but it's an interesting question. Maybe it's your fourth book you can write for me. John?
I wanted to invite you to close the loop on two threads you drew out that seemed to me to be pointed at each other, and I really appreciated your analysis of the way becoming preoccupied with the particularness of your own crisis can become a closure. And then what you said about the Crito, you know, one of the things Socrates says to Crito is, like, didn't we already settle this? But now we're in crisis, and so do we think that these new circumstances will change the answer?
Yeah.
And he indulges it. He says, all right, let's go through it again.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to invite you to sort of close that loop about how in the fusion of horizon of feelings do we stay concrete, but without letting the particularness of the way in which we are unwell become a closure?
Well, this is the thing is that feelings are always concrete, that horizon's always concrete, and in particular, it's the most concrete in its finality. That's what makes it complicated to talk about, I think. Setting that aside for a second.
Just very briefly to say, like, as someone who intellectualizes,
Yeah.
right, there's a flight from the concreteness that's available.
Mm-hmm. And it seems that's what Plato's up to.
Yeah.
That's when, right. This is why I set aside the noetics and eidetics of Plato, because it seems like, oh, the idea of the beauty, and this is sort of, you know, the direction of Platonism went. But I'm just not, like, Tom McPartland has a really rich account for this. I'm not convinced that's Plato. I know that's the history, and I know you can read Plato that way, but I just don't think that's what Plato's up to.
But sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, and even Lonergan sort of says, like, Aristotle's kind of unfair on this point, but he had to be. And there's a sort of story of why he had to be. So we don't Platonize, but you can go back to Plato, and this is why you go back, you're like, I don't know,
Yeah.
What's he doing? And because he's trying to talk to people. Can you imagine, you know, when you learn enough Greek and you run into the idea, you know, the eidos, and what a Greek at that time would have heard is someone say, look, do you see the look? That's what it looks like. Look at this, look at this. And then he's saying, but it doesn't look like anything. And you're like, this is the craziest dude I've ever seen.
Yeah, sure.
Like, we've sort of thematized idea as the content of the act of understanding. But for them, they've just been like, you know, it's seeing is something that sees, but you can't see it. Okay, you're nuts. So I'm running away from that. So it's concrete, and the insight and judgment, all that's where we'd have to do the analysis. But with feelings, it's slightly different because it is always sort of particular. I think, you know, Cody we were talking last night, and, you know, he's working on the way Father Doran talks about transcendence and limitation. I think that's one way to think about that particularization. I use the old language of fixation. Maybe it's a little more Freudian. But this idea that you get fixed on what you can control, and that fixation really is a limitation, I think. And rather than, because you can't fix the transcendence and the dynamism. Marshall makes this point constantly in his clinical writings in psychology, it's a sort of pathology. Freud will say it's a neuroses, but Marshall will note it in intelligence, is you want to fix this sort of thing. And that's what Platonism does, right? That's what ontologism does. You want to fix something. But it is a sort of limiting case, as it were. Does that make some sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot more to be said on that. But so we close down into ourselves.
Yeah.
We stop growth. Because not only is growth scary and open, but it's uncontrollable. Mm-hmm. And in particular, that's a philosophical answer. I was just talking to should know about this idea that you enter the religious and the sort of, Marshall has this line where he says, hope doesn't mean things will turn out the way you imagine. And like that imagination is a fixation. Hope is terrifying then. And so if you want to dare to go back to Luther and the letter, hope, faith is no easy thing, right? The idea, hope is no easy thing in a way that seems facile, but when you're open to that dynamism, because you actually don't know. What you do is you believe, you trust, you have confidence, you love. And that's not an easy thing. So
undesirable to present desire and fearful to present fear. What's that line?
yeah, and when you're talking to students, people who are unwell, in Platonic sense, you know, they come in and they want to say, oh, what I hope for, and they rationalize. They're so good at this, right? We all know this. Like they'll come in and say, well, I'm in school because I want to get a good job. Because I want to care for my family. And they think, oh, thank God I got out of that.
Yeah.
I'm not selfish, I'm not egoist, I'm not a radical individual, I love my family, see? And you're like, no, you didn't get out of it. You just made the problem bigger. I mean, we all know this, but I mean, Plato's always sort of playing on this, that if you really want to get to transcendence, absolute transcendence, insofar as Plato could see it, anticipate it, he at least felt it, right? He's human. And he feels it. It's sort of mystery, right? And that's sort of the religious theological dimension that I always say, you know, oftentimes when we talk about pedagogy, Tim and I have talked about this a lot, and he's helping me see and understand, as well as Greg and you, is we often just don't talk about the fact that as instruments, we're kind of powerless in the sense you're just waiting for the Holy Spirit to work. Yeah, exactly. And you probably will never see it, or it might happen 30 years ago. We all know this, so I'm just kind of droning on.
But that's spiritual direction too.
Yeah, no, that's right. And you can't presume, you know, the Fenelon Guillaume episode of you can be tricked into thinking you're special. And no, you're just serving a role. And that detached, disinterested indifference, as it were, that's really hard. And this is why I always force my students to read Plato. Is Plato a tyrant or is he a philosopher? And of course they say, he's a tyrant. He's the worst. I would kill him too. Everyone has this experience, right? Because he's a jerk. He's making fun of them. And it's like, well, what if this is what the philosopher looks like? And I mean, and then when you get to the Gospels, and of course, like, they will never say that they would kill Jesus too. But I was like, no, I think we would. You know.
In fact, I know we did.
Exactly.
All right,
Thank you so much.
Stop us there. But Andrew, thank you so much.
Don't include me in your problems.